This is a relay project.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
You know, it's not every day we can issue a guarantee at the outset of an episode, but I feel like we can today, and I guarantee you that today, this episode of Real Talk will light a fire under you, regardless of where you stand on a position. I just feel like the two guests that we're going to talk about today have messages that will resonate. In just a second, we're going to talk to Professor Eric Kaufmann, who's joining us out of the University of Buckingham. He's a Canadian, but he's working, teaching classes, political science, as a matter of fact, a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham over in the UK. He's the author of a new report that's been filed for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute titled The Politics of the Culture Wars in Canada. We're going to look into a very simple question, and that is, how woke are Canadians? Now, I know that the word itself acts as a polarizing factor, doesn't it? It's used as a pejorative. Obviously, it's used as an insult. It used to be owned as a compliment, as a badge of honor, but these days it seems that certain positions or certain people are dismissed as woke. But where does the country actually stand on the so-called culture war issues? Professor Kaufmann looked into this, and I'm looking forward to hearing about what he found and then hearing what you make of it. In the second half of this episode, we're going to check back in with Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation Chief Allan Adam. It'll be his third appearance on this program. In April of 2021, he joined us to talk about rates of cancer in the rivers. Basically, the rates of cancer downstream from high-producing oil sands facilities. Looking into his community, the impacts are undeniable. And it just felt like basically, the province, the country, all of us were happy to do nothing about it. And then there was the bombshell. A short time ago, Chief Adam joined us in March of 2023. This after we had realized, after it had become apparent that a toxic leak had been occurring from one of Imperial's oil sands facilities, that Kearl oil sands facility, for almost a year. At that point, it was 9 months, and the First Nation and other surrounding communities had not been notified. Well, there's been a development. As we teed up on our broadcast on our show just the other day, if you were watching this would be the March 6th episode. You probably saw Chief Allan Adam serving papers, essentially informing the CEO of the Alberta Energy Regulator, this is Lori Pusher, that they were going to be facing legal action. And that's exactly what's been happening. A statement of claim has been filed in the Court of King's Bench, and Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations Chief Allan Adam will be joining us to talk about what led to that, what they're hoping to accomplish, and what their message is to the rest of the country. So it's going to be a banger of an episode, to say the very least. And it wouldn't be happening without the support of Business Career College, our presenting sponsor for this episode of the show. They got a pretty simple message to those of you that are looking for a rewarding and high-paying career, but here's the problem: you don't have a university degree. Well, you've been perceiving that to be the problem, but in fact, it turns out it's not a problem at all. You can get started as an insurance professional today with Business Career College. You know, in Canada, insurance agents are making great salaries, oftentimes up to six figures in their first couple of years on the job, and all they've done to get there is take an approved course and pass a licensing exam. Business Career College offers industry-leading approved courses in life insurance, property and casualty insurance, plus their expert instructors are passionate about helping you launch your new career. Now, here's where it gets really cool. Because you're hearing about this or seeing about this on Real Talk, you can save 15% off any Business Career College insurance course with the code REALTALK. That's all one word, Real Talk, when you visit businesscareercollege.com. Well, here's the context for this. It's a report compiled for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. That's where our guest is a senior fellow, The Politics of Culture Wars in Contemporary Canada. He's a Canadian making his way in the UK. He's a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, and he's making his Real Talk debut today. Please join me in welcoming Eric Kaufmann. Eric, thanks so much for making time for us. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Ryan.
Why don't we start by talking about the word woke? It's a powerful word. I know that if you look back at the history of how the word has been used, 1950s, 1960s, the connotations were always very positive, always very admirable. Now it's almost used in a dismissive sense, as a pejorative, as an insult. What does the word woke mean to you?
Yeah, and of course, it tends to be weaponized and used by different sides and misused, I would say. I do think it has a useful social scientific meaning, which is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's the definition of woke. Once you believe that, you're going to see anything that might offend or lead to anything less than an equal result for a member of one of those groups as essentially intolerable and cause for canceling or excommunicating somebody. So it's really the sacredness of these groups, and therefore anything that might be seen as offensive to them is grounds for a kind of excommunication.
What would be the opposite of woke?
Well, so the philosophy that comes out of woke is this idea of equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for these identity groups. The opposite would be, I guess, what you might call a colorblind approach, where it's just about equal individuals. There's really, free speech, objective truth, equal treatment, more of the classical liberal Enlightenment tradition, I guess.
And so how did it evolve from, like, can you take us through the history of, like, as you see fit over the past, let's say, 60 years? Like, if we look back to the civil rights era, I tried to do some reading in preparation to talking to you here, and the word woke was especially predominant when you're talking in the era of, like, Martin Luther King Jr., the Million Man March, like all that kind of stuff. There was a lot of civil unrest, but a lot of civil progress obviously being made in the United States. How did it get to where it is in 2024?
Well, I think that there's a lot of continuity. I'm not one of these people who think that just because Donald Trump or the smartphone came in, suddenly woke emerged. I actually think there's a lot more continuity. So, for example, very quickly, a few years after the civil rights movement was based on classical liberalism, equal treatment, colorblind, etc. Very quickly, we get into affirmative action and its quotas and timetables, goals and timetables for equal results. And that's the origin of affirmative action quotas. So that's moving from a principle of equal treatment to a principle of equal results. And that starts to get codified in bureaucracies and laws in the US. And then subsequently that influences legislation in Britain and other places. Then you have this idea of emotional harm, which is a more recent development. However, what I would say is that the idea of political correctness, that's a term that arose in the late 80s, early 90s. And this idea that somehow words are harmful psychologically, and therefore free speech has to be curtailed through speech codes. First speech codes really start up in the late 80s, and then by 1990, you've already got 300 speech codes and quite a few kind of cancellation attempts. So it's not like this is totally new. I mean, I went to university in the late 80s, early 90s, and some of this was already happening, but it is true that social media makes it easier to have likes and to dogpile people and to have, Twitter mobs and all of those things to organize. So that it's the scaling up really of this activity, and maybe a little bit of radicalization as well. But I think it's mainly about scale, to explain why we've seen a big jump, which has been recorded in data sets in platformings, firing attempts, all of the things that the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions monitors. That really has gone up. It's peaked around 2020, 21's come down a bit, but it's a very real phenomenon.
So I should probably know what speech codes are. What are speech codes?
Yeah, that's sort of telling you what you are allowed to say and not say as a student on campus, as a member of staff. And so, even in 1988, the school newspaper in, I think it was UC Berkeley, made fun of affirmative action as a policy, and the paper was essentially closed down. I mean, that's an example of an early case of cancel culture, because it violated supposedly the speech code that was there to so-called protect and create an inclusive environment. Because the flip side of inclusion is really clamping down on the free speech of those who might make people feel upset and therefore not fully included.
Okay, so you talked to, as part of your research, we'll get into it. You talked to about 1,500 Canadians, and correct me if I'm wrong, and you asked them questions similar to questions asked of the same number of Americans and Britons, and you endeavored to find out, relatively speaking, how quote unquote woke are Canadians. Is that accurately describing your work?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I've done quite similar surveys in Britain and the US in 2021, 2022, and I kind of was interested to see how Canadians compared, because the Canadian policy landscape is quite a bit more woke, let's say, than the British and much of the US. And so I kind of thought, might I find a difference in public opinion? And I was really quite surprised to see that on it doesn't matter if we're talking about critical race and history issues, transgender issues, or free speech cancellation issues, the attitudes in Canada are pretty much the same as in the US and Britain.
Okay, so what put this on your radar? I'm always curious to know the motivation of the researcher. Was this an idea that you came up with? Were you assigned this? How did it come about?
Yeah, no, it's very much an interest of mine. I mean, I've mainly worked on questions of nationalism, populism. I did a book in 2018 on the rise of the populist right. You could see that so-called political correctness, as Trump, for example, used that term then, was a factor already in the growing polarization. I kind of have had a longstanding interest in the intersection of the cultural left with nationalism on the right. And so I kind of wanted to pursue the cultural left interest a bit more through data. Just there's a lot of talk, right? So you wanted to sort of ground some of these findings in data. What did people think, not just in the abstract, but in the concrete about J.K. Rowling? Should she be dropped by her publisher? Should James Damore be fired? These sorts of questions. I wanted to sort of see where the public were. And they really leaned about 2-to-1 against the kind of woke position.
Oh, is that right? The J.K. Rowling question's interesting for a number of reasons. Obviously, number one, how high profile she is. But in my mind, when you're asking about should J.K. Rowling be counseled by her publisher, that's also a commerce question. That's also a business question. That doesn't just, I mean, it's one thing, if there's a university professor, let's talk about Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto and whatever the College of Psychologists of Ontario or whatever it's called, whatever they want to do around his social media training, that's one thing. With J.K. Rowling, it's a completely different conversation. Her publisher may not have any problem whatsoever with the attention gained by her in so long as her books continue to sell hundreds of millions of copies, right? I mean, I guess there's a million ways to approach this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess there's a difference between saying, should she be canceled because her views are abhorrent, and should perhaps, the government or some coalition of businesses seek to shut down that public. I mean, I think it's slightly different. The policy question is maybe slightly different from the kind of moral question in a way. And so I was interested in the former, the kind of moral question, rather than this question of should you regulate businesses versus public sector, etc. But I think in this case, what's interesting is just in Britain, certainly, you find a huge age gap, like the older population, almost nobody says publisher should drop her. And amongst the youngest group is 50-50. And so that was interesting. I mean, in Canada, I think the results were relatively similar.
Well, Professor, when you're talking about, you said, I can't remember exactly your words, but you said something like, Canada, which has more of a woke political landscape or something like that. What would be an example of that? Like, is the Prime Minister who was in the studio a couple of weeks ago, is he woke in your estimation? What would be an example of Canada's woke politics?
Yeah, I think he would be an example of somebody with that belief system. Again, the key there is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. Following on from that, the highest values are equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for those groups as a higher value than, for example, free speech, pursuit of scientific truth, social cohesion, and other sorts of excellence, other sorts of values when they come into conflict, as I believe they do. So in terms of policies, just comparing, let's say, Britain and Canada, in Britain, for example, they shut down the gender reassignment clinic. They have blocked this idea that you can change your gender on your birth certificate without any sort of doctor's note. There is a review into sex education in schools. There have been statements on the floor of the House of Commons decrying critical race theory, decrying the knocking down of statues. That's now been blocked. So there's all kinds of measures that have occurred in Britain that have not occurred in Canada. So Canada is largely not pushed back on any statue toppling for the most part, and certainly federally. They have on the gender stuff, it's just started since New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs in terms of reporting on children's pronouns. But in terms of educational reform, in terms of gender reassignment, all of that has been either quite late or has not occurred in Canada. I think that's a difference, certainly from Britain.
It's very interesting, and we've been talking about this on the show. As you're well aware, we do this show out of the province of Alberta. Alberta becoming the third province to introduce. I mean, I wouldn't even say legislation yet. I'll say policies that will be legislated, I'm sure, at some point that include parental notification if a young student or a student under the age of 18 is going to change their pronouns or their name in school. There's also implications, as you know, for what's taught in sex ed, for the participation of trans women in women's athletics and the like. And it's been interesting. I mean, I don't ever pretend like my Twitter polling is official nor scientific. In fact, I say it's quite the opposite. But we put out an unofficial, unscientific Twitter poll quite some time ago showing that the majority of people actually supported Premier Danielle Smith's position on this, which I think was a surprise to some members of this audience. And generally speaking, a lot of other people were suggesting that the poll had been hijacked and had been polluted. But your research would indicate that maybe not, that maybe the average person, the average Canadian really does have some hesitations around some of these things. They're just afraid to say it out loud.
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is pretty clear that it's over 2-1 against the call it trans activist or gender affirming position. You know, if it's about biological males and women's sports, for example, it's sort of 2-1 against even something like people displaying pronouns voluntarily on emails and social media. The balance is actually slightly against that. The balance is slightly against flying the pride flag on public buildings. Certainly when we get to something like informing parents of pronouns and not allowing gender reassignment surgery for the under 16s, you know, it's over. It's like 4-1 on that second question. So yeah, I think your poll probably was a fair reflection of public opinion. It's not surprising they would support this legislation. And I think what is more surprising is how different the sort of elite public discourse in the elite institutions is from public opinion. I mean, the gap is wider, I would say, in Canada than in Britain and in the US, although it depends red versus blue state.
Yeah, you do write about, and I'll encourage our audience members to check it out. We'll put it in the show notes, the link to your work. You do touch on the different relationship or perceptions that Canadians have with academic institutions as compared to Americans and Britons. I want to ask you about this, though. Here's kind of where I get hung up. You know, when people talk about, use the word woke, I understand in some circumstances, and in others, I just don't think it fits. Like, you know, we're going to talk, for example, to a First Nations chief after we talk to you, and he is flipping mad, and I don't blame him because members of his community have been, you know, the rates of cancer off the charts. You know, I mean, there's a lot of real issues with contamination of the soil and the water due to oil sands activities. And I guarantee you, I'm just trying to come up with an example. This is the first one off the top of my head, where someone will suggest that, you know, serving the Alberta Energy Regulator with papers or taking legal action against big oil. It's the woke agenda. It's part of the woke agenda. It's all these crazy, unhinged environmentalists. That's what the critics will say. But I dare them to say that to Chief Allan Adam's face. This guy's trying to save people's lives for real, you know? And so, you know, you write about Canada's trans affirming policies. And then there's, you know, the kind of the more loaded phrase of trans activism. We look at it, you know, advocates, for example, people speaking on behalf of those kids or looking out for those kids will say, we know more now. We're more enlightened now than before. We're trying to evolve our policies to better protect people, to make society more equitable. You know, it's not woke to try to even the playing field for people that have been historically marginalized. That's kind of how I wrestle with this in my brain, even in determining my own positions on issues and how I talk about them publicly. How do you sort through that?
Well, I think as long as the discussion is evidence-based and logical and there aren't pieties and sort of sacred cows, then yeah, it's not really woke. I think woke really reflects an extremism in the quest for equal outcomes and emotional harm protection. So the environmental stuff, by the way, I would completely exclude from the definition of woke. And likewise with debates around vaccines and tax and all of these things, almost all of that should not be confused with woke, which really revolves around the identity categories. Now, on the Indigenous stuff, however, I think it depends. I mean, if it is about pollution, a concrete measurable thing, then that's not to do with wokeness. But if we're talking about mass graves and, genocide narratives about Canada, I think that is woke. I think that's not evidence-based. So I guess it just depends. I wouldn't necessarily just defer to somebody because of identity. I would look at their evidence. Is there evidence of pollution? Then yeah, absolutely. But if it is simply, I have more identity points than you, or I'm from a group that's been historically marginalized, and you have to sort of shut up because you don't, you're an oppressor, then I think I would have a problem with that.
But
so
with
that's
this,
where I sort of make a distinction.
So when that the First Nation outside Kamloops, they were really the first to come forward. That number 215 resonates with all of Canada. To say that there's a mass grave here, and it really, I think, for a lot of people, I'll never forget that, right? Like, that was just weeks before that year's Canada Day, and that was a very complicated Canada Day for a lot of people. And I saw the critics of that were the Cancel Canada Day movement that were describing the whole thing as woke, but also I think that the average Canadian wants to know, and whether that's different First Nations making decisions on their own to use ground penetrating radar or other. I know that some people have suggested there need to be excavations to prove these assertions. I don't think anybody is, most people are not denying the horrific legacy of Canada's residential schools, but I don't know if the majority of people really call that woke. The claim about the 215 unmarked graves, woke, really?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is because of the sacredness of this group, you cannot criticize claims that are made by this group, even when the forensic science undermines those claims. Then that's an example of woke. Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely. It's one thing to have an initial claim, but if this was a group of Mormons who'd made some claim about people being murdered and the police went in and investigated and found no evidence, then we'd say, no, there is no evidence. There's no documentary evidence. Therefore, in a truth-based society, that truth claim should be overturned. It hasn't been. I think that is a negative consequence of wokeness, the sensitivity to a particular sacralized minority group trumping the search for objective truth. So I think, yes, that is a clear case of wokeness.
What do you think is the right way for the nation to respond to what do I even call it? To the residential school legacy, let's say all encompassing the issue itself. What's the right way, in your opinion, for Canada to grapple with that?
I think that, you have to admit the wrongs that were done in the past. There were abuses there. There's no question about that. But I also think that one has to be fact-based. So you can't just go on claims of grievances, especially if those are incentivized in certain ways, and if they're dominated by certain voices, you have to try and be more scientific. So you should have to compare death rates or from TB or whatever the causes of death rates were at the residential schools with the death rates on the reserve and on the reserve schools. And actually, if you do that, the narrative does not show that I'm no fan of these residential schools, but if you actually look at it contextually, then actually it's a much more complicated picture, and it's not this simple binary black and white morality tale. And also, I think the way that's been used to sort of try and colonize the whole debate about national identity, again, the question has to be, how does Canada compare to other countries? What were Indigenous groups also doing to each other in terms of conquest and slavery? That's got to be part of the conversation. If we're going to have a rounded conversation about, is Canada some awful genocidal country, then we need to have all the facts. And I don't believe that conversation has even started.
Your research shows that 60% of Canadians polled believe that 215 Indigenous residential school children were buried in a mass grave on school grounds in Kamloops, BC. So the majority of people do believe it. Just 15% disagree. However, your research also shows that by a 70-30 margin, let's say 7 out of 10 Canadians oppose the idea that Canada is a racist country, and a similar share do not want this taught at school. Kind of interesting to stack those two research results up against each other.
Yeah, and it is interesting. These are the contradictions, right? You've also got, when asked if Canada's more racist than other countries, it's sort of 92-8, so against that idea.
92% of Canadians say no.
No, that's right. Yeah. I think that if I were to say, I think what's happened on the sort of mass graves issue is it's just that people have heard about these mass graves through the media and through politicians, and they haven't heard the counter arguments from places like, the Dorchester Review and Terry Glavin at the Post and so on.
I don't think the
So it's just
Dorchester
greater
Review has
exposure.
any credibility. I just want to go
What's
on the
that?
record. I don't think that the Dorchester Review has any credibility. I want that on the record. That's Chris Champion, who authored the Alberta curriculum under Jason Kenney. Just for reference for people. In my mind, the record needs to show that I don't give that guy an inch.
Fine. I mean, these are just the names of people that I understand have mentioned or have kind of pushed back against this sort of mass graves narrative. So I just think let's look at the documentary evidence. Let's look at the forensic evidence. That has to be given greater weight than people's views. I mean, that's the way it works in a court. It's the way it works in science. That has to be our guide now. But of course, most people have busy lives and they're just going to tune in a little bit. And then, so yeah, I think that belief is there.
Yeah.
How it's changing, I don't know.
Yeah, you're absolutely not wrong that's how it works in a court of law. That's how it works in science, that evidence is required. Obviously, this is a supercharged issue for a lot of people, and I think the majority of Canadians want the country to do it right. And I think that the majority of Canadians want reconciliation to occur and to be a real thing. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, I think that's very important, but I think that does require a more nuanced view of history, not a romanticization of certain groups and red lines that prevent certain evidence being brought to light because it hurts feelings. I think we have to treat people as equals. We have to go on the evidence, and we have to be contextual. There was slavery in Indigenous societies. There was conquest. Not because they're any worse than anybody else, but that's just human history. That's what groups did to each other. I think we've got to be a lot more knowledgeable about what happened in non-Western societies, and it's not different. But Canada sort of looks better compared to the world historical record than if you just take this very sort of curated, narrow slice, somewhat romanticized slice of history. So I guess my view is it's also got to be reality-based.
Before we wrap, Professor, appreciate your time. You talked earlier in this interview. I think you said around 2020, 2021 was kind of you referred to it as like a peak. And the research shows, your research for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, that by a 78-22 margin, Canadians agree that, quote, political correctness has gone too far. Anecdotally, I hear a lot of people describe how they believe the pendulum is swinging back. And I think if you say that these days to almost anybody, whether or not folks agree, they know exactly what you're talking about. Is the pendulum swinging back in your estimation?
Yeah, I think it is. And we have sort of hard measures, including cancellation numbers and media mentions of these terms to show that. So yes, there is a pendulum swing. I'm not 100% convinced that means that this is the end of woke, which a lot of people are talking about. I think that one of the reasons I say that is simply because if you look at views by age, younger people tend to be more woke on these things. The J.K. Rowling question, for example, and as they become the median voter, median employee, I think that's actually going to make these values stronger, not weaker. Other people disagree with me on that, and that's fine. So yeah, we have hit a peak. We've come down from that, but I'm still not convinced this belief system is on its way out. People said political correctness was a fad that was going to fade as well in the 90s.
We've been talking to Professor Eric Kaufmann, a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. That's for whom he did his research. You can read his report, The Politics of Culture Wars in Contemporary Canada, at macdonaldlaurier.ca. Thanks for joining us from the UK. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Yeah, you bet. See, I knew I was going to light a fire under folks, and I can see our live chat's going nuts, and I know that when the podcast drops, we're going to get a lot of emails on this one, so you can send us your thoughts to talk@ryanjesperson.com. We appreciate that. Chief Allan Adam coming up in just a second. I don't know if he heard that interview. Chief Adam, I might be curious to pick his brain on his thoughts on that. The idea around the woke agenda or woke culture, around culture war issues, and how woke Canada is. It's fascinating subject matter. It hits home and feels like it gets a lot more serious when you're talking about things like the bodies or the unmarked graves of children that were at residential schools, right? That's when something all of a sudden, it's different in my mind, even though it's the same context when you're talking about tearing down, a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald outside Victoria City Hall as an example, as one example. The reasoning behind that, of course, relates to Canada's relationship with Indigenous people, the horrific legacy of residential schools. But then you're just talking about a statue. You're talking about a statue. In the circumstance of First Nations and First Nations leadership coming forward in the most somber and serious announcements saying, we believe that this is what's occurred here, a lot of them conducting ground penetrating radar and that type of thing. That's when it becomes very, like the title of this show, that is real. That is very real. That's when someone like me, I could tell you as well,
Eric,
gets a little uncomfortable even talking about it.
Right?
Eric's
like on the line there. First of all, when he started off, like the definition of woke in the dictionary, it's not connected to cancel culture. I didn't like how he kind of made that line. I can see how some of his evidence-based research did that, but the definition of woke is simply to be concerned, literally in Webster's, concerned about social injustice and discrimination. That's all it means.
I just Googled it when you and I were talking.
It does
we'll
not
go with
include you also are involved in cancel culture or promote cancel culture or, being woke means that everyone you disagree with social injustice has to be canceled. So I didn't like that. But, saying, when he says no evidence, that's on a line there. Because yes, have graves been digged up and bones analyzed? No, but it's clear I think it's pretty clear to experts what's under the soil.
And for a lot of First Nations, and that is a nation by nation decision. We've talked to Indigenous leaders about this on the show. That is a nation-by-nation decision on how they're going to handle that or what they're going to do. There are ground-penetrating radar investigations being done on First Nations as we speak right now in Canada. There are others that believe that they should not be disturbed. Also, and this is not my position on the claims around residential schools, but like Eric said, this is just a fact around how the justice system works, for example, in Canada. In most circumstances, if there's not a body, they don't lay murder charges. That's kind of how. So that is a fact,
but Eric's,
like it or not. But we're not necessarily talking about criminal charges here. We're talking about Canada coming to an understanding of the magnitude of the atrocities committed at residential schools. Now,
it's clear from his own research that the majority of people believe this as well.
60% believe that it is true. Yeah. And obviously he includes that in his report because it's relevant. But I like where his report goes into the uncomfortable areas. They're uncomfortable for a lot of people. Talking about, for example, trans women in sport. I know for a lot of people that's a very uncomfortable conversation to have, but it's a conversation that we need to have. And of course, it's woven into politics now, right? As an example with, Premier Smith and the province of Alberta's new policy on that. Some of you have written into the show to say, how is that a political jurisdiction? What do politicians have to do with sport governing bodies? But others of you are looking around. A buddy of mine talking yesterday about what's happening in golf right now, in women's golf with a trans golfer and saying my buddy just saying, and he's like, I'm not an asshole, but I can't wrap my mind around it. So I understand that the majority of people may not want to go on Twitter and the Twitter account or LinkedIn that says where they work and who their family is and then share how they feel about trans participation in sport. But when people are polled in confidence and in anonymity to a certain degree, they're maybe more willing to say how they feel. And the numbers are interesting when you get into, how Canadians feel about, even flying pride flags. I would feel like 90% of Canadians would be cool with city halls flying pride flags. But the numbers don't show that. Here in Canada by a 70 to 30 margin. So 7 out of 10 Canadians say that they prefer a, quote, color-blind approach to issues in society as opposed to color-conscious. 2-to-1 ratio. Canadians oppose removing statues of Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald. Pretty interesting to see the age gaps as well, as Eric talked about, with younger Canadians more likely to qualify as quote-unquote woke. By the way, Francophone and Anglophone attitudes virtually the same on this, which is another interesting factor. Let us know what you think to talk at ryanjesperson.com. Chief Allan Adam coming up in 2 minutes or less. We're going to talk about him. A statement of claim serving the Alberta Energy Regulator. You may have felt like, I felt like it wasn't a surprise to see it happen. A remarkable development, but it seemed to be the obvious next step. Chief will talk to us about that, Chief Adam, in just a quick second. These conversations are made possible with the support of Real Talk sponsors like our friends at Friesen Brothers, who want to let you know that 17th location is nearing opening day, and you've got to keep it locked right here on Real Talk so we can let you know when the brand new Friesen Brothers is going to be opening up in West Edmonton. But in the meantime, I want to talk to you about their customized Easter dinner box. If you're going to be hosting family or friends and you want to save all the work for somebody else, why not trust the Friesen Brothers team of Red Seal chefs? You customize that personalized Easter dinner. You tell them exactly what you want, and then the next move you make, you put it in the oven to warm it up, and that's it. It's never been easier. You can order today by checking out cateringbyfriesen.com. If you're looking to get organized, if you're looking to declutter in 2024, what are you waiting for? Today's the day to check out californiaclosets.ca and request a free consultation. This team of designers and installers is the absolute best in the business, no question. When it comes to bedrooms, workspaces, living areas, garages, storage rooms, nobody does it better than California Closets. The best part about it, the consultation is absolutely free. You can paint the vision of what you're looking for. They can tell you what that budget might look like. The next thing you know, their team goes to work and your life is organized. All starting with a visit to californiaclosets.ca. If your home improvement is going to be more focused on the outdoors, that's your front yard, your backyard, maybe both, could be your home, could be your business, there's no better option in the Metro Edmonton region than Eden Landscaping. For more than 2 decades, they've been helping people bring outdoor spaces to life, and you can see the evidence on their website, landscapeedmonton.ca. One of the things that they're really proud of is their understanding of what's happening with climate and how that's influencing landscape design. It's impacting what people are doing when it comes to their lawn, the plants they're putting in there, how it's all irrigated. You can start that conversation with Mike and his team at Eden Landscaping today at landscapeedmonton.ca. And before we get to our next interview, a quick shout out to talented engineers. If you got your P-Engine Canada right now and you're looking to make a move, you don't feel like your current workplace, your current team is really helping you make the most of your career, you feel like you've got more to give, Apex Automation would love to talk to you. They're doing work in the energy sector. They're doing work in shipping, in robotics, in mining. They're helping power the country and automating it along the way. And for that, they need the most skilled professionals in the country. If you want to learn more about what working on Team Apex looks like, that culture they're building where you can do your best work, check out the careers link today at apexautomation.ca. It was back in April of 2021 when we first spoke with Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation Chief Allan Adam. He then joined us in March of 2023 with a follow-up. This as the entire nation had come to the realization that a toxic leak had been occurring, contaminating land and water in and around the Imperial Oil Curl oil sands facility. Of course, that includes the land, the water, where Chief Adam and his community hunt, fish, and live. And in a pretty prominent and significant development just in this past week, Chief Adam serving the Alberta Energy Regulator with a statement of claim. That's CEO Lori Pusher that you're seeing in this video that was released by journalist Brandy Morin, journalist Danny Parody as well. Chief Adam joining us this morning on Real Talk. Thank you so much for making time for us. Chief, what led to this moment, this statement of claim being filed? I have to imagine there's been a lot of work happening behind the scenes before we got to this point.
Good morning, Ryan. Leading up to this whole thing was withholding information to the community for CHIP. It went on for 9 months being unreported, and we don't know how much longer it's been leaking before that, because we got reports that it's been leaking longer than 9 months as reported. So, the AER failed. They refused to notify the community. negligence was the big part because they feel that they didn't have to report this and everything, but failing to do so and put the community at risk tells you that something's wrong here. Is the AER, Alberta Energy Regulator, there to help communities from major development downstreams to have their voice heard on environmental issues? Or are they there to expropriate land and take up Crown land and use it for either for agriculture or for development? Because it seems like the AER does the Alberta's deeds for them. And it's the only thing that they have where you cannot sue them, you cannot do anything to them whatsoever, and they feel that they do everything by the books. Well, you may think that you're doing everything by the books, but you fail to protect the community for CHIP and from the communities downstream affected by this mishap. And, in the last year, we've been doing multiple tests and everything, and we're starting to find different traces of, harmful chemicals in our system. Just reached the border mark and everything. And where did this come from? We don't know. And this time will only tell. And if the Alberta Energy Regulator had did its job in the first place, we would have probably done something different, but they failed to do so.
This is obviously a huge black eye on industry. Can you talk to us? I'll let you know. You'll probably be interested, but not surprised to hear that Imperial Oil reached out to us after you and I last spoke in March of last year, and I said, "Well, great. We'd love to have a spokesperson on the show." They've declined to make a spokesperson available, but said they would keep us posted on the progress of that cleanup. What has your correspondence looked like with Imperial Oil in this circumstance, and are you considering legal action against the company?
We sat down and we looked at all the options because we did a discovery on everything. When it came back to us, Imperial did everything by their books. They followed regulatory procedures. And it didn't amount to anything, and it was.
So in other words, they're off the hook, is what you're saying.
Pretty much, and we have an agreement with them. We will sit down and renegotiate the agreement with Imperial to make sure that the environment components are protected.
Do you feel like Imperial's taking this seriously?
Oh, they are very serious that they're taking this serious. They really want to fix the problem. They're very sorry about it, but then time will tell. And it's a mishap happened, and it's unfortunate that we had to find out through third party in that regard. And that was the Alberta Energy Regulator's job to notify us. And we're just taking it from a point of view of contamination of water, the wildlife, the fish, everything. And they're saying that they cannot be harmed or touched in any way, form. Treaty came before the province. Treaty was here before the AER was established and everything. So therefore, we are entrenched into the Constitution under Section 35. We have a lot of things that we have to resolve here because this puts Alberta's Sovereignty Act in question.
Yeah,
because they have no legs to stand on.
Yeah. I mean, add that to the list of what puts that Sovereignty Act into question. How would you describe the spirit of the Energy Regulator's CEO, Laurie Pusher, when you handed him those papers? Like, could you describe that exchange to us and maybe even characterize your relationship with him?
After this incident happened with Imperial, Laurie Pusher, got on the phone and started calling me and giving me regular updates about what is happening and also what was being done on Curl Mine Site. Then he started also, doing what they're supposed to do, but a little too late in our view. The community is very concerned, still concerned, and we have no answers because when we brought this story out a year ago, they said that they will come to us and give us the answers that we've asked Imperial back in the day when they came to the community. All Lori did was that, I'll take this down and I'll come back and give you the answers. That's a year later. So what does that tell you? They do more for a cover-up than they will do to notify the community. And still today, we don't know the severity of the impact that's occurred in our traditional territories. It's still leaking today, which was said because they cannot stop it.
You said it's still leaking today?
Yeah, it's like the dike itself would continue to leak. It's designed to do that. If not, it'll collapse on its own. So it still leaks, but it's still leaking outside of the berm and everything. But they're recovering as much as they possibly can and putting it back into the tailings pond.
I see. So we'll note that none of the allegations have been proven in court. However, the documents show a spill of over 5.3 million liters of toxic chemicals, the failure of 4 tailings ponds. Obviously, this is very relevant and hugely concerning to you and members of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation and members of your community, but it obviously should be concerning to anybody for many different reasons, not just those that are downstream, but I would imagine that this also probably catches the attention of political leadership at a municipal, a provincial, a federal level. What has been the degree of interaction or the degree of interest shown, initiative shown by elected representatives at any of the 3 levels of government in Alberta or elsewhere since this happened?
The Alberta government, they never came around because if they did, we wouldn't be going to court. The federal government, is monitoring the situation. You've heard that we went to Ottawa last April and gave our concerns in regards to what is happening in the area. We put Canada on notice that they are held equally responsible for what is happening here because they had to give the final approval to give the license for Curl Mine to operate, even though it went through the Energy Regulator, Alberta Energy Regulator here in Alberta.
Where do you ultimately see this going? Does your community, are you looking to have that Curl Mine shut down? What do you sort of ultimately best case scenario is that the leak never happens. Best case scenario is that members of your community have not been overly the statistics on cancer rates in your community as you've described for us in past. People can look for our April 28th, 2021 interview where we talked about that. But what is best case scenario, all things considered, today?
What we're looking at is that we're looking for community-based monitoring. We want our people on the ground. We want to do the monitoring on all these sites where they have tailings ponds. We are moving down this direction. I think it'll be more better and safer for us if we have our own people on the ground and notify the community when things happen so they could try to correct the problem. Right now, we don't have that. So therefore, industry is self-monitoring themselves and everything. And when they start to self-monitor themselves in more ways than one, I guess they are a little bit too busy, more ways, in other words, we cannot say that for sure, but there are some gaps there that, fell through and was overlooked. We're just saying that if we have a community-based monitoring program where we from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation people on the ground on these sites and everything to make sure that the operation is continuing to run smoothly like it's written in their permit issues.
We've got some interesting, I'm way out of my wheelhouse here, Chief Adam, so I don't know, I'm not a legal expert, obviously, but we've got some people in our live chat that are watching this that do have it, like the founder of the Polluter Pay Federation, Mark Doran's in here. We got some other people talking about past court action, and it sounds to me, I don't know if I'm right or wrong here, that the regulator may be protected with some sort of immunity here, that maybe court action against the regulator is not the way to go here. I don't know. I'm sure you've got different legal advice on that. Maybe you could comment on that, like who's representing you and what courses of action were suggested before you made this decision. Are you willing to talk about that?
I mentioned that earlier in my statement that Alberta Energy Regulator is protected by the Alberta government. That's why I said that we have constitutionally protected rights under Section 35, which the Alberta Energy Regulator don't have. Prove me wrong if they do, and then I'll prove you wrong in the court of law again.
Randy Thunderhorse is in our chat. He says, can anyone explain to me why the Alberta Energy Regulator flies into Fort Chip with their own case of bottled water? Okay, interesting comment there from Randy. Do you, when you launched, I mean, this is pretty dramatic on Tuesday night, the video that was shown of you serving those papers, it's kind of like this movie moment, and I saw a lot of people reacting strongly online. What's been the response for you? What does your phone look like since Tuesday night? In particular, potentially other community leaders, other Indigenous leaders. Have you received statements of support from other community leaders?
Yeah, we have support from other community leaders. It's the momentum is starting to build. Like you said, people were kind of shocked about the situation, that we handed the papers to the AER at that moment. I think we gave them enough fair warning that this was going to happen in February of this year. And I've always had good communication with ministers of the Alberta government, regardless if it was the former NDP or previous government and the governments before. So, I have open communication with them and try to resolve this issue. And I've always kept them notified that we'll be going to court soon. We don't resolve it, so that's where we're at now.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see how far this makes it down the line. I mean, public opinion on this is big as well. It's something happening in Alberta right now, right? It's obvious. I mean, you look at the fire that was lit under people. I think the story involving your community, that toxic leak. I think obviously people looking at coal mining, coal exploration on the eastern slopes, and it's interesting because you have a province here, a big picture, 4.5 million people, including Indigenous communities, First Nations, to whom the energy industry, big picture, has been huge and has been very important. And you also have people that are looking at the future. They're even looking toward this spring and the water basins and the reservoirs that are dry, and they're looking at all kinds of factors. And it feels like people are, I don't know, there's a tide that's turning. There's public opinion that's swelling around matters of environmental accountability, in particular how it relates to the energy industry. Do you feel that? Do you sense that bigger picture?
Yeah, the bigger picture is happening now. Regardless of win or lose of this court case, we will take it right to the Supreme Court of Canada if we have to. But this puts a mark on how we do development here in Canada, and hopefully that we will correct the problems that we have at hand to move into the future for a environmental friendly state where everybody has a secure mindset that we're doing things right, because right now we don't.
Ken in our live chat says the chief has been patient, fair, pragmatic. He's given both the regulator and Imperial every chance to get their shit together. He says that's how ridiculous this situation is. Alyssa's listening in from Calgary. She wants me to ask you if there's anything, she says, that we can do to help. What can members of the public do if they want to contribute to your efforts?
What the public could do is, put pressure on your MLAs and make sure that they're being held accountable and that we fix this problem, because just because that we are in one of the world's largest industrial movement here in northeastern Alberta, it doesn't mean that there are other gas wells, other oil things in southern Alberta. What would happen if something went wrong down there and you guys couldn't do nothing? So we're putting the Alberta Energy on notice that this can't continue to go on. These things have to be corrected, and they have to make sure that communities downstream are protected in regards to what's going on upstream.
Yeah, appreciate your availability, Chief. I don't know if you got to run. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Did you happen to hear my interview with Eric Kaufmann before you and I spoke from Macdonald Laurier Institute, University of Buckingham? He was talking. I don't know if you heard the whole thing. He was talking about some research he did. This has nothing to do with what you and I are talking about, but you're a community leader and a First Nations chief, so I feel like I want to ask you about this. He was talking about some polling, some research they've done about where Canadians sit on the quote woke agenda, or how Canadians feel about issues around the culture wars, and he started talking about the unmarked graves and residential schools, and the fact that generally speaking there's a quote unquote lack of evidence. He says, like in a court of law or in science, to make assertions or to lay charges or prosecute, you require evidence. And we started. So I said, "Are you telling me that in your estimation, the story of the unmarked graves, these in the thousands that mark in the thousands, is quote unquote woke?" And he said, "Without evidence, yes." And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to respond to that with your personal perspective on where you believe that the country's at right now, including Indigenous people in Canada, following that. It's been about a year and a half coming up on 2 years since those revelations. It's not leading the headlines every single day. That doesn't mean it's not significant. Where do you sit on that right now?
There's a lot of movement in that regard. You got to remember, I'm one of a former residential school survivor here in Fort Chip at the Holy Residential School. When all this broke out, coming from Kelowna and all that, 218 unmarked graves, whatever that they said that were there, and kind of hard to say anything about, but you know what I'm saying. But when we opened this can of worms and we brought it to Alberta, the first thing I did when the story broke, and I followed up on it, I got a hold of the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs here in Alberta, and I wanted to see the education records dating back when residential school occurred here in Alberta. And because of my relationship with the Alberta government, the ministers said, we do have the numbers of unmarked graves, and you will find them in the community. They gave us the list of names of the individuals. They were 78 in total is what we were told. And these are from officials from Alberta. So when you say 60-40, and the atrocities that happened with it is unheard of. Our residential school was by, a boiler. There were talks from the community that newborn babies were put into the inferno. So, and that echoed through the halls of residential school, even when I was there back in the 70s. There were things that kids couldn't talk about, and the only reason why they closed fast-tracked the closure of the Holy Residential School was a year before that. There were some boys that went on a nature walk in the back when it was spring melt, and started to find skeleton bones and hair fragments, and told nuns at the time what was discovered. And since then we were told not to go play back there. We were not allowed to go up on the hill anymore, and the following year the school was closed. So if you have doubts in that regard, I doubt you know more, because these are the things that we were divulged to us. And the only thing that we have an issue with is that, you said it yourself earlier, some people just leave them as they are, let them rest where they are. We know they're there. Unfortunately, we don't know how much we're put into the inferno. When all this came out and everything, my mother, my late mother, I asked her the question about these issues and everything. And then finally she broke the story that one spring her dad went to pick up the family and noticed that one of the girls were missing. And he asked where was his daughter, and he was notified that his daughter had passed away 10 months prior to him coming there, and that her body was buried in Fort Smith, NWT. And he said, why wasn't I notified? They had nothing to say. And at that point in time, my late grandpa took the whole family out of the residential school, including my mother.
Chief, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the question and for being willing to share about something so very personal. It's not why we asked you to come here on the show, but I felt like I had to ask you about it. And I appreciate it, and I appreciate you very much.
Well, I hope that just, put some light into the doubts that are happening out there and everything. And unfortunately, that's the society that we live in. We live in doubt, and some of us live in truth.
That's Chief Allan Adam, Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. We'll talk to you again soon, my friend.
Thank you, Ryan.
You got it. You want to talk about a community leader? That guy's a community leader. It feels like the right time. It feels like a good time to remind you about the amazing work that's done by a good friend of this show. Her name's Connie Walker. She's gone on since she produced the podcast series. You can find it on Spotify, called Stolen: Surviving St. Michael's. Connie was joining us on Real Talk. I guess it was about a year. It was before she won her Pulitzer Prize, John. She won a Pulitzer Prize for this project. Just one of Canada's most talented storytellers, and she's gone on. She's doing more remarkable work, telling some of these stories that have either never been told or at least not been available to members of the general public. The stories have always been there, but they've not necessarily been available for millions of people to really dig into and seek to understand our history. I recommend that you make time to subscribe to Stolen by Connie Walker. She won a Pulitzer for that project. Just some of the most incredible. I mean, if you look, I'll put our interview with her in the show notes. I'm not sure what day it was on, but I'll find it. I'll put it in the show notes and just watch it. She's just,
incredible.
It was like, I think it was an 8 or 10 hour series.
Yeah.
And I listened to it. I think she was on our show on like a Monday or a Tuesday. So on the Saturday and the Sunday.
So did I.
When I was walking the dog.
Driving around.
Yeah, man. I listened to it, and I very rarely will listen to a 10-hour series over 2 days.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what I did. And it's intentional. It's like you're listening. It's like edge of the seat listening. It's uncomfortable. It's very emotional. Mm-hmm. There's a lot going on, and her storytelling technique is really remarkable. The message so important.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, like, everyone's talking, even in the chat, we've got people, and it's fine to go back and forth over evidence of mass graves and residential schools, but just listen to the stories like Chief Allan Adam just told there. Yeah. Go listen to the Stolen podcast. Where do you think these children went? Do you think they evaporated into thin air?
Yeah.
Like he was just talking about playing with remains and stuff like that. I mean, but I get that this is complicated. Like, you can't go, people say, well, why haven't they dug up the graves? Why haven't they done DNA evidence? You can't just desecrate mass grave sites. Number one, some of those people may be resting there intentionally. It may be their final resting place, whether they're Christian, whether they're not. You know what I mean? You can't just go desecrating someone's final resting place. I'm sure some of those graves are intentional. I'm sure a lot of them are mass grave sites, and we're talking about places where They may have put up wooden crosses that eventually just turned into compost. We have no way of knowing. And you, like Allan Adam just said there, leave it be. Yeah, I even was looking at this story as he was talking. People tried to break into some of the Kamloops, some of the areas, and actually, deniers, and try and dig up because they wanted to prove. This was in CBC. Residential school denial.
Nothing.
Tried to dig up suspected unmarked graves in Kamloops, BC. Report finds. So they broke in after hours. Like these. No matter what you think of this, these are people's final resting place, whether they're meant to be there or not. You can't just go desecrate them, right?
It's like, number one, we'll just acknowledge it's important to do this. This is two non-Indigenous people talking about this. We're just having a conversation about something that's relevant in Canada, but I defer to the experts on this, people with lived experience, community leaders, and the like. But I just think that, number one, if you're talking about laying criminal charges, then evidence is important.
Of course.
So that's undeniable. That's just a fact, right? I think that, I think it's on a nation by nation, a First Nation by First Nation basis on what that First Nation decides is the right thing to do. Look at right here in our home city of Edmonton. I know that some of you will be listening. We oftentimes look on our analytics and see that people are tuning in from like New Zealand and the Philippines and Costa Rica, and welcome to all of you. But in our home city of Edmonton, there was a development. I was actually part of it in the very initial stage, the very early stages, something called the Edmonton Project. I was one of the judges, and it led to a plan to put a gondola in the city of Edmonton that would span the North Saskatchewan River Valley. It would go from Old Strathcona, where the rail line used to go, across and then in down to the Rossdale Power Plant area, which is an area with great potential. Sort of think of like the Forks in Winnipeg or Granville Island in Vancouver, but there's also enormous significance to that area, and a big part of that area where some of the big standards, like some of the big support towers were supposed to go, are believed to be Indigenous burial grounds. And so when this project got to that stage of consultation and research and participation with First Nations groups on whether that would be on an ownership front or otherwise, for a lot of the Indigenous voices, it was a non-starter. It was a non-starter. And then you had some proponents of the project saying, and by the way, it flopped in front of city. Like the project just collapsed when it was made known that there had been virtually no consultation in this front, and that on the development side, there really wasn't a significant, basically they were saying even if you did discover something, if the project was already underway, the project would have to continue. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. It's not going to happen. But a lot of people were saying, well, we should know. We should know as a society. We should know as a city for development purposes, in the context of reconciliation. We should know if an area is indeed actually a burial ground.
Sure.
Right? Believed to be and can be two different things. And so people were saying, well, then we should do the work. We should either dig it up or we should do ground penetrating radar or we should whatever.
I was just going to say, you don't need to dig it up.
But a lot of other people are going, especially some Indigenous people with family history in the area are going, excuse me?
Yeah.
Hell no.
It's crazy because ground penetrating radar, and people are arguing about GPD, like we call it, or
GPR probably.
GPR in the chat right now. It's proven. Like experts, we literally use it to plan cemeteries as well as when we're developing nowadays to make sure we're not desecrating other burial sites from the past. So we know they're mass graves. We know there's bodies down there. We don't need to dig. If you're really on the side of reconciliation, we don't need to have the argument about why the bodies are there or not. Listen to the Stolen podcast. Listen to the people who survived and whose families were also desecrated during all this stuff. Listen to the people who, isn't it bad enough that children were stolen from their parents and their culture wiped away? We have to disagree on DNA evidence on what, it's just ridiculous.
Well, like I said, I feel like if we were talking about criminal charges, the conversation's entirely different.
Sure, but that's not what we're doing.
There's nobody, there's, and that's why when Mr. Kaufmann today, our first guest, I've never spoken with him before, didn't really know what to expect. And not a lot of his research, if you check it out, I respect him coming on the show. I appreciate his availability. We're not afraid of uncomfortable conversations. It's okay to disagree, 100%. But when he, like, not a lot of his research, if you'll see, he talks about residential schools. As a matter of fact, I thought we'd get into Sir John A. Macdonald. I thought we'd get into pride flags. I thought we'd get into trans women in sports. I didn't know that we'd get into the burial stuff. But when he brought up the Dorchester Exchange and Chris Champion, that's when I go, because that guy denies. I mean, that guy. Remember this? Like, when Real Talk first started, I don't know if you guys will remember in one of our episodes, I don't know what day it was. There were a lot of days I went on epic rants about Jason Kenney. But one of them was he had hired Chris Champion as basically the architect and the author. I mean, like, the chief architect, if you want to call it, not the official title, my title imposed here, of Alberta's curriculum review. And this was a guy that his social media history shows is basically showing pictures of young Indigenous kids on a jungle gym laughing and smiling and saying that this was residential school. Like this, look at how he says, oh yeah, like really looks like genocide to me. Like this was kind of this guy's take, right? Is this guy's take. He's not walked any of it back as far as I know. So listen, if you're going to cite sources on the show, and we ask for sources, sometimes the audience likes when we do, sometimes you don't. It's always relevant. If your source is that guy, then I'm not going to put much weight into the source. Right? I'd rather go to the sources, go to the knowledge keepers, go to the people that have the traditions over years, and when appropriate and when necessary, obviously pay attention to the science and the evidence.
And you know what bothers me? I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I can tell when people
You're pretty smart, John.
I can tell when people are debating an issue that is unprovable, like this whole mass graves thing. We both know they're not going to desecrate huge mass graves and dig people up so there's never going to be an answer. So people love to go back and forth on it. How about we just shut up and listen and understand that there was some incredibly disgusting, wrong things that happened to Indigenous people spanning decades and decades and decades in this country, and people who are not Indigenous to this place are responsible for it. And then that's just a period on the end of the sentence. Let's just leave it there.
Yeah, I appreciate those of you like Air Mitch and others. There was somebody else as well that was kind of making the point. There's Lisa said, you guys, we need to be referring to unmarked graves rather than mass graves.
Everyone does this.
The connotation is much different. Says agreed that they may have been buried without a marker or a wooden cross that may have disappeared. Travis wonders, should we dig up current cemeteries to verify that the bodies are there, or should we believe the families who know that their family members are indeed dead and gone? That from Travis.
Just listen to this
one.
Listen to the stories. Listen to the Stolen podcast.
Yeah, amazing stuff. Yeah, listen. If there's one takeaway from today, listen to the Stolen podcast. I would say that it's one of the most powerful things you'll ever hear in your life. I want to read an email. This is kind of interesting from Gillian. I was going to save it for the flamethrower coming up on Friday, presented by the DQs of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. By the way, coming up on our Friday, that's March 8th episode, an International Women's Day. Real Talk Roundtable should be great, and the flamethrower is going to be an absolute banger. We got a lot going on. You can send us your hot take, doesn't matter what the subject is, to talk@ryanjesperson.com. The DQs of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park, presenting that weekly on the show. But I feel like in the context of woke Canada and the culture wars and everything else, Gillian's email fits. She's taking aim at Calgary Pride. Did you hear that Calgary Pride is banning all political parties from their parade? And Gillian has a take on that. But first, I want to tell you what's happening at Grand Dog Essentials Quality Raw Food. This is a family-owned business that we've been so proud not just to do business with, but number two, we feed our pets and have fed our pets Grand Dog Essentials Quality Raw Food for many, many years, and we have seen the health benefits. They've got a brand new raw pet food product line. They're really excited about this. This is the Complete Canine. You can learn more when you go to the Shop Now link at granddog.ca. What makes this Complete Canine lineup so special is it's based in Alberta. The food is made in a human-grade, federally inspected facility. All the ingredients sourced from Canada. They've got a lot of protein options like beef and chicken. They've got like kangaroo, duck for those pets with food sensitivities. Check it out under the Shop Now link at granddog.ca. And if you're not sure where to start, you've read a lot about the health benefits of feeding your dog or your cat raw food, but you have questions, they've got raw food specialists available via phone or email. We've worked with them. They're incredible at what they do, and they can answer any questions you may have. It all starts with a visit to granddog.ca. Our friends at Kubi Renewable Energy are putting out the call to job seekers that have experience. Maybe you're an electrician, you've got your ticket, or you're an apprentice. Maybe you work in HR. Maybe you're fabulous at sales, or you're the best office manager anyone's ever seen, and you'd love to be part of the sustainable or green energy movement in Canada, check out the careers link at kubienergy.ca. They're growing clean energy in Canada. You can check out exactly what it looks like to work at Kubi. If you're watching on YouTube, Johnny's showing us some footage from their new Edmonton office. It's the only office I've ever seen in my entire life, Johnny, that has a bonsai tree growing in the middle of the boardroom table. That's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. They've got cold beer on tap, floor hockey on Fridays. They keep the pace fast. And, of course, they're reshaping Canada's energy portfolio. That's the careers link at kubienergy.ca. If you're one of those communities impacted by flooding this spring, or maybe more likely wildfire, I hate to say it so matter of fact, but that's what the experts are telling us. Complete Care Restoration wants you to remember, number one, they hope you never call them. They hope you never find yourself in that situation. But if you do, if you require professional property restoration services in Edmonton, Central, or Northern Alberta, they're ready to respond 24/7, and their entire team is specially certified in their areas of expertise, whether that's remediation, you could be talking about black mold, asbestos, fire, flood, or otherwise. Nobody does a better job. Nobody treats your property like it's their own, like Complete Care Restoration. Got a great email from Gillian to talk at ryanjesperson.com. She says, and this is a story that we've not yet covered, but Gillian says, I don't know exactly what Calgary Pride is thinking of here, banning all political parties from their parade. Her headline, her subject line of her email says, this is a win for the right. Gillian says, there's political parties who have made standing up for the rights of the LGBTQ people, the community, and their children their firebrand. And in a time when the United Conservative Party and Take Back Alberta are clearly coming for LGBTQ communities, at a time when you'll need to opt in to sex ed to learn some boys like boys, or some kids might have two moms, Calgary Pride is seriously going to act like it's too hard and too much effort to vet who's on their side and who isn't? Cool story, bro, says Gillian, but I'm guessing you're just too scared to let the people of Calgary see that conservatives are still failing to stand up for LGBTQ communities. And it's a major slap in the face to the political parties who are. She says, of course the UCP welcomed this decision. When everybody gets punished, that always goes well with the ones who actually did wrong. Gillian says, now I'm wondering if parties on the left in Alberta and Canada will reconsider going to the wall for LGBTQ issues if they'll be regarded as no different than parties who are working to curtail people's rights. And what about the more controversial issues like trans women in sports? Gillian says a lot of folks, like me included, have a real problem with the unfairness of males competing against females in sport. Will progressive parties still take up that fight when they can't even count on an invite to Pride? Gillian says, now I'm not gay, so I don't know what that experience is like, but I sure know what it's like to be a minority and to feel vulnerable and to be misunderstood. So as a woman and a black person, my advice to Calgary Pride is simple. Know who your friends are, or you might find yourself alone. That from Gillian. I thought that was powerful stuff. Do you have a take on political parties or corporations participating in Pride? I know there's a lot of people out there that feel like there should be no corporate representation at Pride.
I would assume that's what everyone would want, but it's really hard today because we had the stories about some police organizations weren't wanted at in some areas, and what happened to it was just like a big celebration and everyone was happy. Now there's all these rules. I don't think Colgate or whoever should be. I don't think anyone should be. I mean, then again, if you're a business that wants to support Pride and you want to have a float or you want to have a piece, why wouldn't you allow them, right? So
I'm of mixed feelings here. In my opinion on this one, doesn't really matter because I'm not a member of the community. People I love are members of the community, but not me. But I feel like on one hand, it's amazing.
You put a rule in there,
to see a big bank change its logo colors to be Pride colors, and everybody goes, "That's great!" Like the bank is supporting its gay, lesbian, and trans employees, and it's sending a message to the rest of the world, and that's fantastic. But then, is there such a thing as if there's greenwashing? I mean, is there rainbow washing?
I was just gonna say, what are the intentions behind some of those large corporations with tons of money who maybe don't give a shit and just want the advertising.
We know that there are many articulate and well-informed members of communities that listen to Real Talk, communities that are impacted by, talked about in the issues that we cover every single day. And you, our valued audience members, are the ones who we most are interested in hearing from on this. If anything that you've heard on today's show is resonating with you, you're walking through your day, you can't stop thinking about it, and it would make you feel better, or you could accomplish something, help educate us by punching that into an email, please do so. Send us an email. It's a talk@ryanjesperson.com, or you can hit us up in the comments or the DMs. Our DMs are open on any of the 3 social media platforms where you'll find @RealTalkRJ. That's Instagram, TikTok, and of course, Twitter. Coming up on Friday's Real Talk, it's March 8th. It's International Women's Day. We've got a Real Talk roundtable coming together that you won't want to miss. Plus, like we said, our inbox has been absolutely on fire over the past week or so with submissions for the flamethrower presented by the DQs of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. That's how we'll wrap our Friday episode. Thanks so much for joining us for this one, for Real Talk. We'll do it all again tomorrow, and we'll talk to you then.
Real Talk is hosted by Ryan Jesperson. Executive producer Josh Dunford. Technical producer John Hicks.